Welcome to the CXPA sponsored webinar by Qualtrics. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Leah Lee, and I'm a CXP program assistant with the CXPA. This webinar is being recorded, and the recording will be emailed to you later today. The recording will also be made available on the webinar page of the CXPA website. And for all of our CXP certified attendees, this webinar is CRC eligible and will be recorded in your account within 2 weeks. I'd like to introduce our speaker for today, Bruce Timken. He is the head of Qualtrics XM Institute at Qualtrics. Bruce is an experience management visionary and is often referred to as the godfather of customer experience. He leads the Qualtrics XM Institute, which provides thought leadership and training to help organizations around the world master XM, while at the same time igniting a global community of XM professionals to radically improve the human experience. If you have any questions throughout the webinar, please enter them in the question box on your GoToWebinar control panel. We will have time for Q&A later on this hour. Additionally, if any attendees would like a behind-the-scene tour of the Qualtrics XM software in action, please complete their survey in the chat window. And now, without further ado, I'll hand it over to Bruce to get us started.
Hi. Oh, awesome. Well, thank you. It's wonderful to be here. I appreciate that intro, and I think one part of my background that's probably most important for this audience, if you don't know, I was the co-founder and architect of the CXPA and the initial chair, and I'm chair emeritus, so it's wonderful to be back home talking to my peeps at the CXPA about some research that we did that I think is it's one of the most exciting research efforts that I've done in several years, so I'm excited to be sharing it with you today. Before I go into talking about the trends that we found in our research, I'll share with you a little bit about the XM Institute in case you have any interest in that. We do thought leadership, so we're doing research like what I'm going to be showing you today, along with best practices, a lot of other publications. We're publishing, you know, a couple times a week, so there is a lot of content that is easily available and easy to find and easy to sort through, and it's all there for helping experience management professionals do their job. We have our own community of XM professionals called the XM Professionals Network, and we do training and certification. If you're interested in any of that, it's really easy to find out more. All you have to do is go to xminstitute.com. Almost all of our resources, just about all of them, are free. So I urge you to go to xminstitute.com and see what's there for your help. All right, now what I want to do is talk about the research that I mentioned, and here's the study that I'm going to be drawing upon. We looked at 18 countries, 17 industries, and nearly 18,000 consumers. You can see those countries, I list them there. I've highlighted US and Canada because I think during this presentation, I will showcase a little bit more highlight from those two countries because I think this is mostly a North American audience, but I'll show you in the context of the global results. So if you're from another country, you can certainly look and find your data. The 17 industries, it's interesting. Someone said, why don't you go with 18 industries and you can 18, 18, 18? And I think looking at this chart, if I put this chart together, I would have found another industry to add. So we were 18, 18, 18, but we only have 17 industries. You'll see that there are 10 of those industries have been highlighted. Those are industries where we have data from all 18 countries. You can imagine that different countries have different patterns of usage of those different industries, especially during COVID. So we don't have data covering all of those industries across all of the countries. So I'll only in this presentation talk about the 10 bolded industries where we have data across all 18 countries. And then the consumers, we have 18,000 consumers, nearly 18,000, about 1,000 consumers in each country except for Hong Kong and South Korea, where we're a little bit less. And all of those groupings of consumers have been weighted to match the country's distribution for age, income, and gender. So the sample in each one of those countries are reflective of their populations. All right, with all of that said, I will tell you that this research really ended up giving us a ton of insights, and a ton of things were published and still publishing, and we're probably not even going to publish all of what we could because there's so many different ways to look at it. But I decided for this presentation that I would identify a number of different things. So this is sort of the agenda for this webinar. I also have to give you an early warning that almost, I would say in general, I don't like showing a lot of data during a presentation. Data can be boring on webinars and boring on presentations. So in my real life, in the massive things that I do, I hardly ever show a lot of data. I only bring that up because this webinar is going to have a ton of data. I made a strategic decision that given all of the stuff that we had, that you would be willing to hang in there with me if I ended up showing you more data than a human being should actually have to sit through. Now, the good news is I don't want you to be writing down data points or doing it. Just try to absorb the overall information, because you can get access to all of this for free. We're publishing it. I think there's in the chat that you'll be able to download one of the reports that we published, a global report, and if you go to the XM Institute site, you'll get a lot more. So just hang in there as I go through these selected highlights from the study, and I'm going to start with the first item on the list, which is looking at how consumers choose the companies they buy from. So to do this, we asked a question of the consumers: if you had a choice of companies to buy from, which of the following would you choose? And we gave them, they had to pick one of the four: a company that offers very good products, treats you very well, offers very low prices, or does very good things for society. And here's the overall results from across all 18 countries. Not surprising, you have to offer very good products and services. That's sort of like an entry point. You wouldn't want to buy from someone who didn't give you that stuff. But what's I think gets really interesting is that the second item on the list is that they treat you very well, and offering very low prices is third and fourth. So this is globally the look of how consumers choose the companies they buy from. Let's take a closer look at how this data differs by country. And this is a chart that type of chart you'll see a lot of. Right down the left-hand side are all of the countries we looked at. And so the takeaway from here is that if we look at offering very good products, Japanese consumers care the most about that, and Thai consumers care the least. Right? You can sort of go down the list. And before I go and identify more highlights, I'm going to help you look at US and Canada, because remember I said I'm going to highlight those a little bit. So let me add just a little bit of highlighting, since I know that most of you are from US and Canada on this particular webinar, so I'll make it easier for you to find that data. All right, so as I said, Japanese are the top when it comes to looking for the very good products. Thai is the bottom. When it comes to treating you very well, you go to the bottom list. Brazil and Thai consumers care the most about being treated very well. You know, Canadian and US are somewhere in the middle. When it comes to offering very low prices, that's where Canadians are at the top. So Canadians are the most price sensitive of the group of consumers across the 18 countries that we looked at, and then doing very good things for society. At the top of that list are Thai consumers. They really care about that the most. And at the low end of doing very good things for society are the French consumers. So you already start to see, hopefully, there's a pattern with just a very simple question like this, that you start to understand that you cannot really have a single global strategy if you're trying to deal with consumers. And as we go through the study, I want you to remember that these are people, right? And although we're showing you the data in the context of what I would say is a customer experience mindset, This data refers to the human beings who are also employees, right? So you can have a mindset around that about what the employees are thinking about, because these are just consumers who are both customers and employees and everything else. They're patients, they're partners, they're just all of the human beings that you deal with in your entire ecosystem. All right, now I want to ask a second question I'm going to look at is really evaluating companies, the customer experience that companies deliver. But I want to, before I go into that, I want to actually do a little poll. I want to get you involved. I want it not as if I have data enough from me, I want data from you. So we're gonna push this poll out to you, and I just want you to think honestly, how would you rate the customer experience that your organization typically delivers? From 1 star, very poor, to 5 stars. So if you can jump on, get that poll going, that would be great. Hopefully the poll is out there now. I can see you have the poll out there. You have the choice. How would you rate the customer experience your organization typically delivers? And be honest here. I know sometimes you're thinking, well, am I going to judge you based on your answer? No, I don't know who's answering this and what your unique answer is. So I don't know what you're doing. Just be honest. Is your company delivering 1 star, 2 star, 3 star, 4 star, or 5 star customer experience typically? We'll give you, 20 more seconds or so to answer that question, because I want to see who we have on this webinar. Like I said, be honest, don't be shy, share your information, and let's go. I think we probably gave them enough time to answer the poll, so if we can look at the results, that would be great. Interesting. You are mostly 3 and 4 star companies, with over 52% of you, over half of you 3 star. I would say that that's great, because that means that most of you on this call are here and believe that your organization has opportunities to improve. It's also interesting. I'm not surprised by the grouping in 3 and 4 star, which is probably better than the whole universe of companies, right? Because if you're from a company that's like a 1 star, and some of you are from 2 stars, not many, you're probably not looking at webinars like this very often, and you may not even be part of the CXPA because you're with an organization that doesn't care. But it's great to see that many of you are have companies that you think are doing, at least starting to do a decent job with an opportunity to improve. All right, so let's eliminate the poll and go back to that same question. But now what I'm going to do is look at our data across countries, because we had consumers answer that very same question. And the data I'm going to look at is the percentage of consumers that selected 4 or 5 stars. So that's the data we're going to look at now across country, but we're going to look at it from the context of different industries. Remember, I told you we're going to look at those 10 industries. Well, here's this chart, and I'll spend a little time because we're going to see this chart a couple of times. On the left-hand side, you see those 10 industries: banks, department stores, fast food, restaurants. You got the list. You can read it on your own. And then for each one of those industries, we have a line, and on the left-hand side of the line is a blue box that represents the lowest scoring country for that industry. For banks, that means it's Japan. The green circle represents the average for that industry. And over the right-hand side, that purplish triangle represents the high country for that industry. In this case, it's Indonesia, which is at 88%. All right, I'll give you a second to absorb this chart, and I'm going to talk about how I'd like you to look at it. I'm going to have you look at 3 things. Let's start by looking at the left-hand side. All of those blue boxes. You'll notice something about those blue boxes, not only that they shift by industry, but that Japan is at the low end of every industry except for mobile phone providers, where Brazilian consumers give them the low marks. So Japanese consumers across 9 out of the 10 industries give those companies the lowest marks. At the other end, they're all either India or Indonesia that are giving the high scores, right? So we have Japan, pretty much Japan on the left side, India and Indonesia on the right-hand side. Now, one of the questions that people ask, and we'll probably go over this a few times, is, does that mean that all of these industries in Japan are delivering the poorest experiences, and all these industries in Indonesia and India are providing the best experience? So there's we don't have the data to tease that exactly apart, but it's pretty obvious that a lot of these responses are driven by cultural norms, right? That in Indonesia and India, they're just used to giving higher scores, and in Japan, they're used to giving lower scores, lower ratings on these. So there may or may not be a substantive difference in the level of the experience that's delivered, for instance, in banks at the top between Japan and Indonesia, but those consumers are certainly rating those experiences differently. Now, if we look at those circles, which are the averages, you look between 70 and 80%, probably between 74 and 77%. Most of the averages fall in there, except for 3 circles, right? There are 3 places where the industries are substantially, on average, across the country, across the world, lower than the rest. And that's internet service providers, mobile phone providers, and public utilities. All right, that's a lot, and that's only a little piece of this data. So let's look at another question. I forgot to say that I almost forgot that I did put Canada and US for you to look at on this chart. I almost forgot that we were focusing on a little bit on that. And what you see is that across the board, except when it comes to hospital and medical clinics, US consumers rate their experiences higher than Canadians. The one exception, hospital and medical clinics. And they tend to be tight in the ratings. The place where US is substantially higher in its rating than Canadian consumers are for their mobile phone providers. So what's interesting is, even if you think about, there's differences across the globe, certainly we see that in responses between Japan and Indonesia. But even in the North America, between Canada and US, substantive differences in how consumers are rating their experiences. And I mentioned larger in some areas, smaller in others. All right, on to the next question. Let's talk about trust. We're going to ask the question, how likely are you to trust these companies? And we'll look at the data from the consumers that selected either somewhat likely or extremely likely. Kind of a parallel to what we did with the star rating, looking at the percentage who gave 4 or 5 stars. These are the people who are likely to trust the company. And once again, you see the same chart. So if you learned it on the last time, you now have advantages for understanding it with this one. If we look on the left-hand side, we'll do the same thing. Let's look on the left-hand side, those blue boxes. It's not now all Japan, right? But it's a lot of Japan, but now we have Germany showing up in several. So German consumers tend to have a lower trust than a lot of the other countries. Japan still is on the left-hand side for most, and Spain is the lowest trusting set of consumers when it comes to banks. On the right-hand side, similar to what we saw before, with mostly Indonesia giving the highest trust ratings, Indian one, and when it comes to hospital medical clinics, we have a tie amongst a few. All right. Now, if you look at those circles, which are the level of trust, right? We have internet service providers and mobile service providers are those 2 circles all the way over to the left. Those are sort of outliers on the low level of trust, and sort of the outliers on the high level of trust are hospital and medical clinics and supermarkets. All of the other ones are in sort of a tighter range around average of trust. I know what you're saying, Bruce. Wow, this is a lot of data. So I just, like I said, more data than I normally do, but I just wanted to share with you a bunch of things so you could pull out the interesting factoids that you could use. And then if we look at Canada and US again, we find a very similar pattern, right? With US having higher trust ratings across all of the industries except for hospital and medical clinics, where Canadian consumers are much more trusting of their providers. And the spreads is highest with online retailers. So US consumers are considerably more trusting of online retailers than are Canadian consumers. All right, good going. On to the next data chart. Remember what I said, apologize up front. This is way more data than I normally present, but there's a lot of great insights. And I think if you pick out the stuff that you can use, you can adjust your strategies both in the country you deal with, and certainly as you think about any global strategies that you have. All right, let's talk about the impact of experience and look at how consumers like how the experience that people have, right, has impacted their likely to trust and likelihood to repurchase from those companies. And what we're going to do is this. This is a new chart, so I'll give you time to orient it. If we look at banks all the way on the top left, let's look at that. We're now looking at data for 10 industries. Look at the banks. The way to read that chart is consumers who gave banks a 1 or 2-star rating, 23% of those consumers are likely to trust the bank. When they gave them a 3-star rating, 52% of those consumers are likely to trust the bank. When they gave a 4-star rating, 81% of the consumers are likely to trust the bank. And when they gave the bank a 5-star rating, 91% of those consumers are likely to trust the bank. Big takeaway here, not hard to tell. As the star ratings goes up, so does trust. And if you look at the difference between a 1 and 2-star rating and a 5-star rating, it's 3 to 4 times higher across the board. In other words, as you go from a very low experience delivered to a very high experience delivered, you can see a 3 or 4 times increase in the trust that you get from your consumers. Highly correlated. Better customer experience leads to more trusting consumers, and that's true across the world. Now, if we look at the data for, instead of trust, the likelihood of consumers to buy more, so looking at the connection between future purchases, you see a very similar pattern. Obviously, the data is different. The data is difference between this and the trust data. The data is difference across all of the 10 industries, but the pattern is the same. You get a considerable jump in consumers who are likely to buy more from you as you deliver better experiences. So experience is highly correlated to trust and future purchases, and we show that with as a global phenomenon. Now we're going to be publishing a report, the ROI of CX, that'll talk about more of the nuances across countries when it comes to this connection, but pretty much a global phenomena. Higher customer experience leads to higher trust and higher likelihood to purchase more. All right, next one, Net Promoter Calibration. Raise your hand if you use Net Promoter Score. How many of you did I get you to raise your hand? You know I can't see you, no one else can see you, but I probably caught some of you raising your hands because I know that on any conversation with a customer experience community, especially with the CXPA, there are going to be a bunch of you that use Net Promoter Score. And I imagine that some of you are doing it in a global setting. So this was actually one of my favorite pieces of the analysis. I know I shouldn't say that, I shouldn't have favorites, but this was one of the favorites because we wanted to understand how consumers around the world answered the Net Promoter Score and did they do it differently. So we asked 2 questions. Think about the companies that you like. How likely would you be to recommend them to your friends? And then we had a second question, which is think about the companies that you dislike. How likely would you be to recommend them to your friends and relatives? And the answer we had them respond on the 11-point standard Net Promoter Score scale. So what we're doing is sort of removing any industry specificity on it, and by genericizing it like this, we really can do a nice comparison of how consumers attack and this Net Promoter Score scale. And here's what we got. So when consumers like a company, this is interesting because I didn't realize it, but we lost some of the company names up there. So at the top of the list, I have to go back to my beautiful charts here. At the top of the list is Indonesia or India. So when Indian consumers like a company, the company ends up with 64 Net Promoter Score. If you go to the right, when an Indian consumers dislike a company, they end up with a -7 Net Promoter Score, and the gap there is 71 points in between. So 71 point is the gap between when they like and dislike. Now, if you go all the way down to the bottom, Japan, when a consumer likes a Japanese company, they end up with a -7 Net Promoter Score. I'm going to let that sink in for a second. And I know what you're saying. Did Bruce just make a mistake in what he's saying? No. When Japanese consumers like a company, they end up giving it a -47 Net Promoter Score. When they dislike it, it ends up with a -88. So when they like it, it's a -47. When they dislike it, it's a -88. You can see the gap there is only 41. So this is a situation where for those of you who know Net Promoter Score, right? There's a somewhat arbitrary cutoff between 0 and 6. And then grouping 7 and 8, 9 and 10. Clearly, that grouping is not reflective of promoters and detractors in Japan. And the good news is I just published a post all about this. We published a report that you can download for free, so you can get access to all of the data and the countries that are missing on this list. You can see Canada is the second line down there, but key takeaway for this is that consumers around the world answer this completely differently, right? And I would say that there are a bunch of countries that you shouldn't even think about using Net Promoter Score in. At the top of it is Japan. Clearly, Net Promoter Score in Japan is not accurately segmenting the people who are brand promoters from the people who are brand detractors. So key finding here, Net Promoter Score is answered differently, and therefore you should not even think about having a global goal for NPS. Imagine if you had a global organization, you were thinking about, okay, let's set a standard Net Promoter Score goal, and in your territories that you care about are both Japan and India. You could not set a Net Promoter Score that was reasonable, because if you pick something in the middle, it would either be too easy for India or too hard, and at the same time being too hard for Japan to hit. So we really have to think about not only Net Promoter Score, but probably all of our experience data-based metrics in light of the countries in which we're having them, because I think that this dramatic shift in score has a lot to do with how Net Promoter Score is calculated, but it also has to do with how consumers rate people on scales, which you saw before, right? That Indian consumers tend to give higher ratings, Indonesian consumers tend to give higher ratings, Japanese consumers tend to give lower ratings. So it's really not fair or probably appropriate to set a global goal, because like I said, a single global goal will be too easy for some countries and too hard for others. All right, let's move on. The next on our hit list, and once again, we're doing the best of series. We wanted to look at channel preferences. We asked the question, which of the following ways would you most prefer to accomplish? And we asked this about 8 different common interactions. I'll show you them in a second. And we gave them the option of picking one of these 5 channels to do the interaction. Talk to someone on the phone, chat with the person on your computer, meet with someone in person, self-service on their mobile phone, or self-service on their computer. And here's how the data played out. You can see the 8 interactions that we looked at on the left-hand side. Once again, we looked at these globally. Book an airline ticket, get status on an order you made, select a new mobile phone plan, apply for a new bank account, schedule a medical appointment, purchase a new television, resolve an issue with a bill, or get technical support for a computer. The reason we pick those are, you might be wondering why we pick those, is we thought that with a handful of common interactions, we would get a sense of how consumers want to do lots of interaction. Because even if you're not a company that has those types of interactions, think about which ones are pretty close to the ones your customers have. And also think about the ones that are pretty close to what your employees have, right? Because very similar, once again, consumers are both customers and employees. So if you think about these as being representative types of interactions, not specific interactions, you'll probably see that a number of them relate to your organization. Then we have bar charts, right? The bar chart across shows the percentage that selected each one of those 5 options. Now, I know at this point, if I'm looking at this chart, it is a lot of data and it is really hard to interpret. So I'm going to break it down and hopefully make it a little bit easier to understand or to have takeaways. First of all, let's just look at the self-service components. There are 2 self-service components, computer and mobile phone. And what we see from this data is booking an airline ticket is the most digital self-service activity of the bunch, followed not too far away from getting status of an order that you made. And then at the bottom of the digital list is resolving an issue with a bill or getting technical support for a computer. Those are the places where consumers are least likely to want to do those on their own self-service. Now, the other interesting thing to note is just the difference between self-service on the computer and mobile phone, right? But booking a ticket, an airline ticket, is more biased, for instance, towards doing it on a computer. Getting status of an order you made is more biased to doing that on your mobile phone. So there are even nuances on preferences between doing self-service on a computer or on their mobile phone. And we're going to look at that again by country, which will be pretty interesting. Now let's look on the right-hand side, which are the non-self-service channels. What do we see when it comes to meeting with someone in person? Two of those transactions jump out: applying for a bank account or purchasing a new television. Purchasing a new television is surprising, right? People probably want to touch, feel, and look at the entity that they're buying. And applying for a new bank account is interesting because I think that's probably something that people don't do a lot of, and they might be looking for some actual interactions and cues from a human being about how to do it because they don't trust the process. When it comes to talking to someone on the phone, two interactions jump out there: scheduling a medical appointment and resolving an issue with a bill. And then at the top of the list for chatting with the person on your computer is getting technical support. And so technical support is really the only place that has a meaningful number of people who want to use that channel. All right, you get the sense of it. Let's look at this data by country, because I think it's even more fascinating by country. And what we did here is we just, instead of looking at each individual interaction, we merged them all together and looked at all of the data across all of the interactions for those different countries. And remember, this is the colorful chart, but it's easier when we look at it in pieces. So let's look at the pieces. When it comes to self-service, right, Hong Kong, India, and Thailand and are at the top, followed not far by Indonesia and Singapore. You can see those are the most digital oriented places, but there is quite a difference. Even if you look at the top 4, right? Hong Kong and India are much more computer oriented than Thailand and Indonesia that are almost completely mobile oriented. So even having the same self-service profile across those countries, there's a radical difference in the preference for doing things on the computer versus on the mobile phone. And then you can see towards the bottom of the list, US and Canada, where those are, somewhere towards the bottom of preferring self-service, and they both tend to be a little bit higher in the computer orientation than certainly some of the sort of more self-service oriented countries. All right, that's self-service. Let's all the way over to the right, meeting in person. Where do people want to meet in person? In Spain. You didn't guess that one, did you? In the Spanish consumers are the most likely to want to have their interactions completed in person. At the low end of that, right, the Indian consumers are the least likely to want to do things in person. Talking on the phone, this is the place where US and Canada top the list. US and Canadian consumers are the chattiest of all consumers, at least on the phone. They're at the top of the list of preferring to use a phone for the interactions. Then when it comes to chatting on your computer, there's not a huge gap across the board, but the 2 highest areas are India and Thailand. All right, cool. Hopefully you're learning tidbits that you can use for your organization. Let's move on to the pandemic. And I want to have a poll before we go into our pandemic data to see how well you can predict our data. So here's the question. Which online activity do you think will continue the most after the pandemic? Online videos with friends and families, ordering groceries online, handling banking online, or participating in online exercise classes? Let's go with the poll. I want you to pick the answer that you think is going to continue the most after the pandemic. These are all online activities that some people started for the first time online. And part of our research is to try and understand not just what happened during COVID, but how likely are those behaviors to continue afterwards. So this is really getting you to be able to predict which one of these 4 online activities do you think will continue the most, will have the most momentum after the pandemic. I'll give you a few seconds more to answer the question, give you some time to think about it. Only 4 options. Don't give it a lot of thought. Go with your gut. I'm not gonna, you're not gonna lose any points if you get a wrong answer. There actually, and unfortunately, there's no prizes for people who pick the right answer. We're just trying to get a sense of where you collectively think the answer is. And I think we've given you plenty of time to answer the poll. So let's take a look at the responses and see what you all came up with. So the number 1 response for you is ordering groceries online, followed by handling banking online. Very few of you thought online videos with friends and family or online exercise classes were going to be the thing that continues the most. So let's remember as a group, your number 1 pick was ordering groceries online. Let's go back to the presentation and see how you did. And as I mentioned, in this section, we're going to look at two types of data. One is just what started during the coronavirus, and that's not where we're going to check the data that you had. But then we'll look at the issue of momentum after COVID. Just first with, what did people start? The number 1 place that people started doing something online, and this is global data, not individual country data, was participating in an online video with friends or family or friends. It was the number 1 new online activity of the list that we had. And interesting enough, based on your responses, very few of you thought that this is an activity that is going to be at the top of the list and they're going to continue on. And you can see how the rest of these activities fall down. These are the activities we asked about. And then the none of these at the bottom of the list, 23%. The way to think about that is 77%. So more than 3/4 of consumers started at least one of these online activities for the first time during COVID. That's amazing. So just if you step back there, right? COVID did a lot of things that like just were a shake up to how we led our lives. But think about having 3/4 of the consumers around the world picked up a new online activity in a year. That's amazing adoption of anything, right? If you think about just global adoptions. That gives you a sense of the magnitude of the change in behaviors that we saw last year, over this last year plus. Let's look at what we expect going forward. And this is the answers to the question of whether people were planning to do more, about the same, or less or not at all across these activities. And so you can see at the top of the list, 39% of consumers were planning to do more personal banking. That was at the top of the list. So I think that was the second pick of this audience. About 40% of you picked that. But 45% of you picked ordering groceries online. Look where that is, much lower on the list. So that was the number one. So you didn't quite get this right. But even this has a lot of data. So on the chart, so we developed what we're calling sort of a little bit of a momentum index. And the way we calculated a momentum index is we took the percentage of those that plan to do more and subtracted the percentage that we're going to do less or not at all. And the way this works at the top of the list for banking is you take the 39% that said they were going to do more, you subtract the 14% that said they were going to do less, and you end up with a plus 24 momentum index. Plus 25 momentum index. And here's the data for all of the rest of the momentum indexes. And you can see that at the top of the list, it goes as you'd expect. There are 4 of these activities that have sizable positive momentum. Handling personal banking, purchasing a product online, watching a movie or TV online, and contacting customer service online. And then you have a bunch of them that have very little momentum, and even at the bottom, some that have negative momentum. And the item that has the most negative momentum is attending religious services online. All right, that's overall. That's looking at all consumers across the world. Let's look at this by country. And so we looked at those same 8 activities. And you've seen this chart before. You know what the squares, the circles, and the diamonds mean. And the 0, it represents the place where there is neither positive nor negative momentum. So if anything that's over to the left of that 0 line means that there's negative momentum. All the things over the right means they're positive momentum. And what we're showing you is the low country, high country, and average for the country. If you look at like handling personal banking online, you can see there is a negative momentum for that in Spain and significantly high momentum for that in India. The spreads are even bigger when we get to the bottom, right, between attending a religious service, where it's really negative in Germany, and participating in online video with friends and family, where it's also highly negative in Germany. And if you look at that negative, there's a lot of negative momentum for online activities in Germany, in Spain, and on the right-hand side, a lot of positive momentum for India in a lot of those online activities. So let's take a look at US and Canada. As we've been doing across the board, pretty much the online momentum is higher in the US than it is in Canada, meaning in the US, we expect to see these activities continue to grow at a faster pace than we expect to see them in Canada. In some cases, US has positive momentum and Canada has negative momentum, especially if we look at all the way at the bottom, participating in online video with friends and family. US has a little bit of positive momentum. Canada has significantly negative momentum in that area. So lots of differences in online momentum. And like I said, there's a lot of interesting data that we could pull here and talk more about, but I wanted to give you an overview of some of the insights that we found in this amazing global study. And once again, that you can get access to many ways, downloading the report we have on the resources here, going to the XM Institute website, going to the Qualtrics site and downloading a study that we published there. All great stuff, all available for you for free. So what does all of this mean? My goodness, lots of data. What does it all mean? Let me sort of just put my prescriptive hat on and talk about what it means to you. First of all, consumer needs are shifting, right? We see that. Behaviors are changing, a lot moving towards online. Some things changed in COVID. Some are going to continue to change. Some are going to come back. So we're living in a world where you have to, at least for the next 12 or 18 months, assume that lots is still going to change, especially when we bring in the fact that, you know, return to work and employee lives are changing simultaneously with consumers and people living in their houses. All that is under radical change and isn't going to normalize at least for the next year. So you need to build sense and respond capabilities. As all this change is going on, you can't go back to the world where we're going to just compare our metrics like Net Promoter Score to our previous year and start tracking and trending. It's more important that you understand the nuances of what's changing in the moment and how you can respond to those changes in a much faster pace than you have historically done, because the pace of change and the pace of shifting of consumer needs is not like it's ever been in the years past. It's not going to be like that abrupt change that we saw a year ago with COVID. It's going to be a much more nuanced set of changes and shifts that are going on that you're going to have to be able to monitor and respond to in an ongoing way. As you do that, employees will be critical for driving CX agility, right? CX agility is about the sense and respond, but you're going to be asking consumers, you're going to be asking employees, right? What they're seeing, what they're hearing, you're going to be asking them to change some of their behaviors and some of their activities and what we have them do, because that's the only way you actually respond to these needs, right? We're going to get employees to do slightly different things and change and approach. So really making sure that employees are part of this agility is going to be central. At the same time, we're changing the work lives of those employees and bringing them back to work and lots of things going on. So employees are going to be critical in this next year or 18 months, even more than they've ever been in the past. And if you follow my work, you know that I believe employees are the most critical asset that any organization has. And with all of that going on, experience design is more important than ever, because we're going to need to be creating new experiences for customers, new experiences for employees. And the way that we craft those experiences to make sure they're driven by insights, co-created by the audiences that are using them, all of that is going to be a central capability for every organization in this moment. And so my big sort of bottom line on this is that you need to prepare for the future. Don't recreate the past. We're not going to lock into a world where you can just go back to what you're doing, and that was sort of, it was good enough before, it's good enough now. We're not there. We're not going to be there for at least another year. You need to operate in a much more dynamic mode and prepare for the future, and don't expect that you're going to get ever get back to the way you were operating in the past. With that, my final slide, just remember you can find lots of great content at xminstitute.com, and I highly recommend that you subscribe to our monthly journal, which gives you all of the updates on XM in your inbox once a month. So with that, let's open it up for questions.
Thanks, Bruce, for the great presentation today. Now we do have a bit of time for question, so don't forget that you can submit your question via the question box on your GoToWebinar control panel. I do see one that came through here, Bruce. So when choosing a company to buy from, to what extent are responses driven by cultural societal norms?
Yep, good question. I think in those, that particular question is least driven by differences by cultural norms and is more an accurate description. Whenever, if we give people a list of things where there's a clear label of those things, there's less cultural interpretation there than there is when we ask questions on scales. So scaled questions and more perceptive questions tend to have more cultural variance. So I think that the variances we see there are actual preferences as opposed to just people answering those questions differently.
Thank you. Here's the next question. What question do you use to get at the notion of trust? What question would you recommend companies to use to measure trust?
Yeah, so trust is an interesting. I will say that the question we used is just how likely are you to trust the company? Very generic question, and the reason we do very generic questions is, if you think about it, we're asking a question that has to work across industry, across country, right? So we have to find, we end up with a very sort of lowest common denominator generic question around trust. I think so that's what we use. That's first part of the question. For you, for your organization, I think it's important that every organization understand, what does trust mean for you, and what does trust mean in the eyes of your customers, and use that knowledge to figure out how you would ask a question and measure trust. Because I think trust is going to be slightly different, and we're going to want to think about it differently for every industries, and also for different companies in each industry. Like there can be companies that really sort of are building the foundation of the differentiation on trust, in which case it should be a central part of our measurement system, and others where it's not, where maybe we don't even ask or track trust.
Great. So here's the next question. How do you channel preferences vary by consumer demographics?
Great question. We're actually publishing on some data. We'll be publishing data on that, and there are some differences, like you would expect, that older consumers are less likely than younger consumers to use some of the online channels and want to have more of the in-person, whether they're over the phone or directly in-person types of interactions. So those are differences you see, but interesting enough, when it comes to some of the channel preferences, it's not the youngest consumer. So we only look at adults. I should say this, our study was of adults, so it's 18 and older. And it turns out that the 18 to 24-year-olds, which is the lowest group the youngest group in our study, are not the most liking online. It's a little bit older group that wants to do things more online. So I think that there's a misconception sometimes that young adults are the ones that really want to do the most things online. It's not that they're far off. It's just that there still is a bias in younger adults to want to do some things with people that tends to go away as people get closer into their 30s. Late 20s and 30s, and then, tends to come back as they age, the need and desire to do things less self-service and more interacting with people.
Okay, thanks, Bruce. So here's the next one. How can we get US and Canadian consumers to adopt more self-service tendency?
Great question. I think it's, first of all, better design. Design experiences that are easy to use. I think that there's there clearly is a cultural bias in some of the countries that are leading in self-service, that they don't have a history of doing a lot of in-person stuff per se, and so digital has become much more of a norm. But I think it's important for, if you are in a global industry, or your company is operating globally, or if you think about being globally competitive, then you need to make sure that your customers and your employees are using self-service at a level that's going to be globally competitive. So I think it has to do with having a clear understanding of what the needs and desires and expectations are around the people that you want to and should be using your digital platforms, you need to use a closed loop process of getting feedback and understanding and making changes based on that, right? And like I said, really good experience design encompasses all of that, right? We need to choose what are the things that we're going to actually offer through online self-service. We need to understand the requirements that our target audience has for those things that we're going to put online, and then we need to craft and develop the experiences with feedback along the way that will encourage and encourage people to use it in the first place, and then keep them using it because it's easy to use and it fulfills their needs over time.
Thank you, Bruce. All right, we do have a question from the audience here. Last question here. Do you feel there will be a new way to look at customer forgiveness in correlation to trust post-pandemic?
I do. That's a great question, and it's interesting. In the past we've tracked forgiveness. For those of you who follow my work for years, we looked at forgiveness, and we do that in some other studies. We didn't look at it here, but I do think that we're already seeing some of that now, right? If you just look at some of the craziness that's happening in airports and airplanes where people are arguing and fighting, right? I think that over the last year, people were willing to sort of forgive things that they didn't like for the greater good. And you see that that's going away now as people start go back to normal. Because I like one of the things that, and I've been able to look at behaviors and consumers and companies in many different downturns and shifts. None of them quite as sort of overwhelming as this COVID pandemic has been. But one of the things is consumers are amazingly resilient, and resilient for good and resilient for bad. Resilient for good is, we're going to get back out there. We're going to start doing it. We're going to start buying. I'm from Boston. At Fenway Park, as soon as they opened up, the park filled up, right? People went right back to watching baseball. But that's a positive resilience. We're going to get back to it. The negative resilience is all of the positive things that we did, being nice to each other, caring, and having a forgiving heart. Unfortunately, I think that some of that goodness is going to disappear as well.
Thank you, Bruce. As we are reaching the end of the hour here, we all enjoy hearing from Bruce Timken from Qualtrics. Hopefully you're all walking away with fresh new ideas and insights today. As a reminder, we have recorded this webinar and it will be emailed to you later today. The recording will be posted on the webinars page of the CXPA website. Again, if attendees would like a behind-the-scene tour of Qualtrics XM software in action, please complete the survey in the chat window. And if you are a CXP, your CRC for attending this webinar will be added to your account within 2 weeks. Again, I would like to thank Bruce for his insights today, and I also like to mention our appreciation for Qualtrics for the ongoing support of the CXPA. And we hope you all have a great rest of your day. Bye, everyone.